Hi, Masha. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Happy 2021.
I hope it's going to be a happy 2021. Remains to be seen.
So, we've talked a lot about which foods are kosher and which foods are not, but we really haven't discussed why we have this distinction. And so, can you explain the origins of kosher and its role today in Jewish life?
Well, yeah, it's confusing because the laws of kashrut of keeping kosher come from the Torah, and in the Torah, it does not tell us why we should do it. It basically says, "Be holy, so don't eat these things. Only eat these things, because I'm God, and I told you to be holy." So it's not a huge reason there. So the earliest kind of reason that people talk about is basically the idea of distinction, which is what holiness means. The word kadosh, holy in Hebrew, really means separated out. So
Mm.
it's that was maybe the first thing on the origins of kashrut was be separate from other people. Other people eat pigs, we're not going to eat pigs. Other people eat this, we're not going to eat that. So you have eating practices that identify you. Um, but the commentators, the ancient rabbis, and later on, people started talking about other reasons that they found. Again, they're not in the Torah, they're not explicit, but they noticed, for example, that a lot of the animals that you're not allowed to eat are predators.
Mm.
And they said, okay, well, maybe this is saying something about the idea that you might, if by eating them, you might imbibe this kind of predatory instinct. And so you want to avoid that. Or the idea, very explicit in the Torah, that you shouldn't eat blood. The
Mm.
part of keeping kosher is you try to minimize to the extent you can any blood. You salt the meat to let blood out, all that stuff.
Mhm.
And that was trying to literally make people not bloodthirsty.
Mm.
So there's this idea that you're trying to convey something, and then people started talking metaphorically about the idea of trying to not be like birds of prey, not be like wild animals, um, and then people started talking about the idea that the whole system maybe is designed to curb our appetite for meat because it makes it
Mm.
difficult. It says these animals you can't eat, these animals you can't eat. I mean, it's not a, that's not for people who are hungry. It's like, how could you do that? But the effect of the system really is to make meat eating more difficult.
Mm.
Um, and some people then look back at the beginning of the Torah in the Garden of Eden and say, hey, the Garden of Eden, everybody ate fruit. And maybe that's actually the ideal way to live, is not to kill
Mm.
animals in order to eat. And they noticed that if you happen to be a vegetarian, like me, then you automatically keep kosher. Like there's
Mhm.
just, kashrut is really concerned about meat. But if you take meat out of the equation, that you've sort of fulfilled all of the strictures of keeping kosher. So some people do argue that it's actually meant to be a way to sort of push us into vegetarianism.
Mm.
And then I think one of the strong arguments that people make is the idea of training, that you take literally an appetite, right? One of these really core drivers of human beings as animals, um, and say, yeah, we're going to put all sorts of strictures on that. We're going to put restrictions on your ability to just eat what you want when you want to eat it, right? The
Mhm.
fact that keeping kosher means that for people who eat meat, that after you eat meat, you can't eat dairy for a certain amount of time and all that sort of stuff. We're going to put all these rules on you for something that's really core to being human. And that's going to train you for tough moral decision making that you might face later in your life, right? So if you can manage to walk by that bacon cheeseburger and not eat it, then maybe you'll be able to walk by those people who are, committing violence and not join in. Maybe you'll be
Mhm.
able to control your other appetites, like your appetite for power or control or things like that. And maybe that will help.
Mhm.
So I'm giving you a smorgasbord of reasons, and which is a typical rabbinic thing to do, but especially in this case, as with almost all of the mitzvot, all of the commandments in the Torah, almost none of them have any reason given. And it's
Mm.
been up to rabbinic tradition and commentators and us talking to figure out why these things might be important. And with the idea, I think that if you have reasons behind them, people might be more
Mhm.
likely to do it. you know, if it's just like, well, just because, then it's harder to see. And
Mhm.
I think keeping kosher is one of those where people, since it's so core to our daily lives, it's something people have come up with a lot of, I think, pretty good reasons that you might think about why you should do that.
Mhm. I want to go back to an earlier point that you made about separation and that keeping kosher is a way to keep the Jewish people separate from, say, a broader population. What
Mm.
do you think its role is in contemporary world where the separation is really hard to create?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it initially, if I'm thinking like in biblical times for the for the
Mhm.
biblical writers, um, they they thought also thought separation is hard. Like, how
Mhm.
do you become separate? You see all these people around you who are, worshiping idols, doing all sorts of things you don't want people to do. How do you keep people separate? Maybe they thought
Mhm.
eating practices was one way to separate people out.
Mhm.
These days, I'm not sure that we think about it in terms of there's a value to keeping people separate.
Mhm.
I think we tend to think much more about it as there's a value to, for example, there's another example I didn't give before, but there's a value to thinking about where does your food come from? What is this that I am eating? And where does what impact does it have on the world? And what impact does it have on me to eat it? So tend to, because there also is in modern times such an ability for people to eat in a differentiated way, right? I can
Mhm.
sit next to you and you can eat one thing and I can eat something else. And that's pretty easy for us to manage in a market economy. I think the value of the separation has been less. I think for some Jewish communities, that's still an important part of kashrut.
Mhm.
And it does drive people, for example, to seek out, like if they're traveling, they're going to meet other Jews who keep kosher because they're going to the kosher restaurants or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, but I think for a lot of people, it's these these sort of more, actually more personal reasons
Mhm.
that drive people. And I'll also say that kashrut is, it's a very complicated subject, and there's a lot of disagreement about you should do this, you should do that, this food's okay, this food is not, this supervision is okay, this is not, all that stuff. It's almost like each person who keeps kosher keeps it in a slightly different way.
Mhm.
So you're kind of, it's not really like there's the uniform group of all the people who keep kosher who agree about how you should eat, and then there's other people. Even among other people who keep kosher, people are going to be negotiating different eating practices.
Mhm.
So I think in that way, it's not that separating. I think the one way it can be separating is if people make the decision that, for example, they're not going to eat in the homes of people who don't keep kosher in the same way that they do.
Mhm.
And that's, I guess that could separate you from social occasions. But I think mostly in those situations, people are like, oh, just come to our house and try to connect past these eating practices. And I'll say also, just to finish up, that I think that it's easier these days, at least in the kind of circles that I run in, where lots of people have different eating practices
Mhm.
separate from keeping kosher, right? There's a lot of people who don't eat gluten, or they don't eat this, or they don't eat that. They're vegan. They're like, the idea of having a sort of ideology about how you eat has
Mhm.
become really widespread.
Mhm.
And so in many ways it makes it easier to keep kosher because you're like, oh, you do that, I do this.